welcome back to Green TV. We are global. The World Wide Web makes that possible. And I'm really excited to have my first international guest, and that is Mr. Charles Alder, who is, I don't know if you started it, but with Ecoforce Australia and Ecoforce Global. And I talked to Charles just yesterday, and I was so excited hearing what he and they have done in Australia. I said, you've got to come on. We need to do more Ecoforce action in the not yet green enough United States. So thanks so much for joining us, and especially early Monday morning in Australia. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Betsy. Thank you for having me. And I'm looking forward to sharing what we're doing with you all.
So take us back to the beginning of your interest in our planet.
Yeah, well, back in 2013, my wife and I were reading a story in one of Australia's major newspapers about farmers who were shooting their cattle due to a drought that we were facing, which was at that stage predominantly in Queensland. And we decided that we should do something about it. Not having any interest in agriculture whatsoever, apart from spending a little bit of time in my school holidays when I was a bit younger, doing a bit of fencing, we came up with a fundraising campaign called Buy a Bale, which was where we asked Australians to buy a digital bale online, and we would then buy the hay from a hay farmer who at that stage didn't have hay to sell. Well, sorry, they didn't have farmers who could afford to buy it. And so we were buying the hay from the hay farmers, and we then employed truck drivers to deliver it. And we provided hay to farmers across Australia. And I suppose when it came to the drought of 2018, which was when the drought from Queensland moved really heavily into New South Wales, a little bit like what you've now got in the western or southwest parts of the United States. We were known as the organisation that was delivering the assistance, and we were able to attract the vast majority of corporate support around Australia. And in 2018, 2019, we raised 50 million in a 12-month period. We raised another 30 million the year after that. And so over the 8 years that we founded and ran the charity, we raised over $100 million. So that really piqued our interest in agriculture. And I suppose we learned a lot during that time.
What were you doing prior to that for a living?
My background's I've always been in gift and loyalty card marketing programs. So I've always looked at consumer trends and consumer data. And well before Facebook knew things about you, I knew things about you from your shopping habits. Mm-hmm. So that was an interesting foray, but it gave us a foundation in terms of data capture at the charity that allowed us to be able to reach very influential and important people. At one stage, the charity had in excess of 150,000 donors on its database. So we had direct email and direct SMS access to every one of those people. So in terms of a marketing machine to be able to get our message out to people, we could get directly to people. And that was very important for us.
And of course, that was before the biblical fires that just ravaged Australia. And, yeah. Has the drought continued there?
The drought still continues in Queensland. Queensland has been under the same drought conditions from about 2011 through to today, so 8 years.
Is it true that farmers were taking their lives because of drought and difficult conditions? And how much of that was a factor in your Buy a Bale campaign?
I think there've always been people who have been unable to deal with the stress of circumstances. And I think there's some element of farmers getting to that point where they can no longer continue. There were many reports of farmers that suicided, which we were able to prove weren't actually true. And to some extent, it's a little bit of a media play that, people are taking their lives and therefore you've got to do more to support more. There is a general level of resilience in rural communities, but we did notice that particularly the younger farmers, so 60 and older, had a greater level of resilience to 40s and unders. And so one of the things we actually did was we recognized that in times of drought, hay is a great thing to be able to deliver, but it's really not a sustainable program. So we actually established Australia's first, and still is, only on-farm counselling program. So we take counsellors, we put them in vehicles, and we effectively let them loose to visit farmers in their and on their own properties, in their own circumstance. It's not a telephone counselling service, it's not a Zoom, it's not an SMS service. And we found that was important to be able to get the truth of the situation so that our counselling service was able to deliver the most appropriate level of support that these farmers needed. And in many cases, it wasn't actually that they had mental challenges. It was just a capacity challenge, that they actually couldn't do their job on a daily basis. They were just worn out emotionally, mentally, physically, and they just needed a hand. So we would organise for a bunch of volunteers to go and spend a week on their farm, self-contained, and the volunteers would pick up the slack. So there are various ways of getting around the issue of mental health challenges. I'm not sure that medication or suicide was always the headline that needed to be spoken about.
And of course, that problem was not unique to Australia, but I do recall hearing about it happening more often there.
Yeah.
And I assume that a lot of it was because of unpredictable weather patterns. I mean, when you're dealing with drought and fires, and that is certainly not unique to Australia.
Yeah, I think around the world, our farmers are finding it particularly tough. And I know every country has different levels of support for their farming communities. Some countries have high levels of subsidies and therefore able to provide a financial platform for some of their farmers. Other countries have none. Australia has very few farming subsidies for farmers. We don't have the population to be able to sustain the level of farming subsidies that some countries do. And so there are some challenges for farmers, but in relation to the environment and the situation farmers find themselves in, to some extent, they've made some of the mess themselves. We have had mass clearings of trees and vegetation over time. We've had a predominance to use chemicals in farming instead of using traditional methods of agriculture. And that's really come down to a scale issue. Farmers have needed to generate the same amount of revenue per hectare just to be able to cover their cost of farming. And so I think over time, we've actually lost some of that capacity to be able to manage the environment and the business in some cases.
And what happened in the wake of the bushfires? I imagine your services, Ecoforce Australia, were needed more than ever. Did you transition to something different, step up what you were doing, or and what did that lead up to? What are you working on now?
So in May of last year, so May of 2020, we left the charity and we decided that we'd done our time. The reason for starting the Ecoforce business was that we saw, when we were running the charity, we actually funded a number of soil regeneration case studies. And we found from that data that there was a significant opportunity for farmers to capture carbon in their soil and improve the general landscape. But most consumers aren't really interested in supporting farmers in their soil. And there wasn't really an opportunity to align that with consumers. And we need to get consumers on board with this issue of climate change and weather events, etc. So what we've decided to do, in the same way that we used the Buy a Bale program to connect with consumers, is that we started a Buy a Tree program. And so the Ecoforce business is all about consumers and corporates around the world buying trees that we then plant on farmers' properties. We pay the farmers to plant and care for the trees, and we allow them to use that funding to convert their farming practices from industrial ag, the use of chemicals, etc., to regenerative ag. And it's a way of making the financial challenge from one to the other less, but also having an engagement of the communities around the world to actually support farmers. Because I think in general, communities really do want to support farmers. They are seen to be without them, we don't eat. So, exactly. They are absolutely fundamental.
Yeah.
They are fundamental to the planet. So the Ecoforce business is we're engaging consumers to buy trees online. We take the responsibility to find the planting site and then work with the farmers to capture the carbon and hopefully draw down enough CO2 that en masse around the world, we can do something about climate change.
Well, there has been some criticism with all these plant-a-tree programs, which are great. And I belong to one, treesisters.org, and make a monthly donation, and they plant trees around the world. But now you're hearing some pushback. Well, there's not enough land to plant trees all over the place. And it does mess with the natural ecosystems. And as you pointed out in our chat before this one, a lot of those trees don't make it, don't last. They're planted, but they don't necessarily turn into oxygen sucking healthy trees.
Correct. Yeah, and that's one of the fundamental differences between our program, is that we actually work with, so a farmer comes on board with us, we source a local supplier of plants, we deal with local environmental organisations to find the best plants to suit the environment that we're actually going to plant them in. And so in terms of provenance of the plantings that we actually do, they completely meet the ecosystem in which they're to be grown effectively. And we also look at the diversity and of plants that we actually will plant on a farmer's property. Farmers own over 50% of the world's land mass. So when it comes to access to land, farmers are the one group that have got plenty of space to plant plenty of trees. And once they understand that not only the economic, but also the environmental value of actually building a diverse ecosystem on their properties in terms of animal life, bird life, bug and insect life, etc. They're all great for the farm. We are finding that farmers are far more interested in saying, okay, well, talk to me more about this. How can I be part of the process? And that's what we're really enjoying.
So you're going to do windmills on farmlands next?
No.
Or solar farms on farms?
No, we're sticking with trees. And if there was any extension, we would go to kelp in the oceans. Yep.
To what in the oceans? I didn't hear that.
Kelp.
Kelp.
So we go to seaweed, kelp in the ocean.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sorry, the accent. I'm not so good with accents. So I love the name Ecoforce. We, got Space Force. What the heck is that? But Ecoforce to me is what we need, which is, to me, implies people, an army on the grounds, making our ecology better in full force and in so many ways. Do you have broader, ambitious plans, or is this plenty? And if you are, in fact, Ecoforce Global, not just Australia, what are you doing or hoping to do in other countries, hopefully including United States?
So yes, that's exactly the reason why we chose the name. We want to be a force for change in the eco and the environmental space. And we want people who are advocates for Ecoforce to be educated about the planet, share that message with people, effectively sell more trees so we can plant more trees. There's literally enough for us to do in this space that we actually don't need to branch out, excuse the pun, into too many other areas, because we literally need to plant billions of trees every year. Depends on who you listen to or talk to, but there are billions cut down every year, and we need to reverse not only or replace the ones that are cut down, but get into a positive space in terms of carbon sequestration.
And what about the concern about monoculture, that when trees are cut down in a forest, God forbid rainforest, and you replant other trees, new trees, that you lose a lot of that, juicy ecosystem web of life?
I think that that's fundamentally important, that we actually replace what we cut down with what we've cut down in the first place. We can't have monoculture plantings. In the same way that we can't have farmers planting the same crops year after year after year and hoping that the soil will continue to grow their crops for them. So we've got to look at diversity, and our whole planet is diverse. You and I are diverse, Betsy, in our outlooks on life and the food we eat and the drinks that we consume. And so we can't expect that the planet simply wants to eat the same hamburger day after day, or the same piece of soil needs the same piece of nutrient every day. So no matter how we look at our planet, it's a seriously diverse culture. It's a group of people, it's plants, it's ecosystems. We can't just be replacing one plant type, for sure.
I want to talk about soil. The regenerative farming soil movement is huge and growing as it needs to. That is a part of what you're doing. How quickly is that spreading in Australia?
Regenerative agriculture is certainly, as I say, it's on a hockey stick in terms of adoption. It's been through the trough, and the conversation is being had daily on farms in Australia. It's almost mainstream ag news now in Australia, and the numbers of farmers who are adopting it and have participated in training courses. I know of one organisation that's had over 6,000 people through a regenerative ag training course over the last probably 10 or 15 years. And I think in some cases, the cost to convert to regenerative ag has been one of the issues that farmers have faced. For some of them, it can be $50,000, $100,000 worth of cost over a 2-year period to move from traditional to regenerative ag. So that for some of them has been an impediment, but those who have adopted it are doing particularly well.
Curious, it sounds like it's very similar to the transition to organic. It takes a while to get certified organic, and that was an impediment, but more and more farmers are going that way here, hopefully there too.
Correct. There are more farmers who want the profitable way of farming, if you could say it like that, and the process to convert to regenerative it's normally a 3 or 4 year process for the farmers that we know of in Australia. But the guys who are there now and are moving across are seeing considerable income growth. They've got much fatter cattle, they've got much better quality land. Even in areas where we supplied them hay 6 or 7 years ago, these guys are doing particularly well.
And does regenerative soil come with organic? Are they like two sides of the same coin, or are they two different but parallel track movements, transitions?
There's very little difference really from what I can read or understand of organic and regenerative. I suppose one of them uses chemicals in places, very small amounts of chemicals, but that really is about the definitive difference between the two of them. So I think there has been some conversation within the organic and regenerative ag sectors about how do we brand ourselves, how do we market ourselves, how do we create a point of differentiation. I think the challenge is that they're both pretty similar. At the end of the day, for consumers, it's important that we actually get a much better quality product. It's better for us. There's less pesticides and in our food systems. And I don't know about you, Betsy, but I see and hear of so many people today with illnesses that I've been able to read back into the 40s and 50s, and I never heard of people with so many illnesses like we have today in society, and just wonder about the ramifications of our food system for each of us. The challenges that our world is facing, whether it be politics, whether it be economics, whether it be business, whether it be the climate. There are undoubtable facts today out there and scientific proof that man has changed its planet. And unless we actually do something about reversing it, it won't matter how left or right you have a political stance. In 20 or 30 years, there won't be a Fox News, or there won't be organisations who are completely disbelieve it, because we just don't have a plan.
There may not be a livable planet in 20 or 30 years, in no small part thanks to the 20-year and continuing disinformation campaign. This is just so wrong. I think it's criminal. And if I could find a lawyer who would do a class action suit, I would be in the front lines. I know there's a First Amendment, but you can't shout fire in a crowded theater, but nor should you be able to say there's no fire if there is one. And correct. Yeah, if this has touched a nerve.
And I think one of the interesting challenges with social media these days is that supposedly we can get access to more information than ever before, but I think it's so easy for people to put out disinformation that it makes it harder for people to actually, well, it's not harder. I think people are lazier today to actually check the veracity of the information that's in front of them. And, it's like email spam, or it's like viruses. If people are still being caught with viruses in their emails after 30 and 40 years of, having, maybe 20 years of having the email around, more fool you. We've had plenty of opportunity to learn about them. And the same thing with SMS viruses that we're now getting. So I think people are lazier. They're just taking everything on face value without checking anything. I had a situation. Yep. The
people who have the COVID virus and spread it to people who don't necessarily believe that it's fake, it's life and death, and it's continuing as we speak. It's continuing. Sorry.
Yep. So I think, there's a very interesting article that was posted on Facebook just a day or two ago about the people who were born in the 1900s and the fact that they went through the First World War, the Second World War, they went through the pandemic, they went through the Depression, and they all came out okay. And, there's a vast, they have lived our world and run our world for the last 100 years, more or less. We seem to have lost a little bit of our capacity to be able to manage things and to be able to call BS when it is BS. And politically in Australia, that's a challenge that we face down here. We have a government that is not a climate believer, yet, we are paying, and this is the staggering thing, and you guys are facing it today as we're recording this. There's another hurricane that's going through New Orleans, 150 miles wide or so, I believe, 210 miles an hour winds, whatever. We're talking about mass destruction. We're talking about billions of dollars of economic damage being done here, in no real difference to COVID's economic damage. Yet COVID seems to get far more awareness and far more money. Yet if we want to reduce the amount of money that it's going to cost us to rebuild these homes, lives, businesses, communities, we need governments to understand that weather is just as bad as an economic disaster. And we've got to do ways of mitigating it.
Yeah, I mean, I was on the air on my show on Air America 16 years ago today when Katrina was slamming in to the Gulf Coast, and it was obviously a hurricane unlike any other we'd seen, on steroids. And I said on my program, this almost certainly is climate change arrived on our shores, mark my words. And I'm not saying, look how smart I was. I'm saying, look how long it's taken to get many, many more people, including, you know, the news networks, to connect the dots and to, you know, prepare people properly, and mostly for us to start doing everything we can to slow climate collapse. Really, climate change seems too mild. I call it climate chaos, or even climate collapse. That's not exaggerating. Look what's going on. I mean, and if it's not wildfires in my home state of California, it's flooding in Tennessee that took 20 plus lives. Unlike, and the signature is always, we've never seen this before. This derecho, tornado, hurricane, wildfire, snowpocalypse, it's all unprecedented. And yet it's not like stop the presses, all hands on deck. We need to make this top of the heap priorities, news, funding, preparation. Yes, New Orleans is more prepared this time, $20 billion later, whatever. But it's just kind of appalling how far we haven't come in terms of the urgency, even with the IPCC report, Code Red for Humanity, out a few weeks ago. Hopefully that will have more impact. It seemed to make the news for one day, Monday, when it was released, and the next day in the States, we were back to, you know, Andrew Cuomo being forced to resign, and COVID, and then Afghanistan and Haiti. And these are all real stories and real news. But when it's off the front page and it's not on CNN, people, you know, you almost can't blame them for thinking, well, guess it's not that big of a problem, because it's not like they did COVID 24/7, which guess what, changed behavior and showed that there was a life and death emergency that stopped the whole world. It should be exactly the same with climate change, and it still isn't.
And I think one of the challenges for climate change is that unless it's actually happening in my environment, I'm not actually seeing it or living it today. But if we put together a list, for example, of the last 6 months of the weather events around the world that are calamitous in scale, you know, you're talking about the floods in Beijing, you're talking about floods in central London, you're talking about floods in Germany and Belgium,
typhoons,
we're talking about wildfires, we're talking about rain falling instead of snow in the Arctic. You know, these are all massive climatic events which individually actually don't say much, but collectively mean that there is something seriously bad going on here, and we need to be connecting the dots.
And nobody is safe. It's coming for all of us. We moved from California right before 2-3 years in a row of terrible wildfires. We have friends who lost their home, a friend who lost his ranch. And I was grateful that my husband moved us here, because I breathed enough smoke being a reporter for 10 years and covering fires. And yet we're not off the hook. We had Snowmageddon. Oh my God, that was harrowing as heck and unprecedented. And just look on any given week. So if people really think it doesn't affect me, like maybe a couple of years ago, but if they think that now, they're just not paying attention. That is one advantage to 24/7 news networks, news sometimes, social media, you know, it doesn't just happen in an isolated way anymore. So we're almost out of time. I could probably speak to you all day. It's really interesting hearing what's going on, you know, in your neck of the woods. And it's always nice to kind of compare and contrast. Are you ahead of us in some ways, behind, about the same as America? Any concluding thoughts about, you know, either things we can learn from you, or what you're following us doing, or are we just all in this sinking boat together and it's kind of, we're doing it haphazardly?
Yeah, I think I'd say that in general, farming communities around the world are looking for new ways to be more sustainable. The old ways of doing it are no longer viable in terms of financial viability. And that's also affecting the land's productive capacity. So I think farmers are at the forefront of this. I think we do need to get consumers on board that there is a way that they can actually participate in the repair process. And we're hoping at Ecoforce that that's our method of asking people to buy a tree. You know, if every person on the planet bought a tree or 10 trees a year, you know, we're talking about billions of trees. We could do some really great work in terms of capturing CO2. But the challenges are much bigger than just CO2. There are some real societal challenges that we face. Unless we actually do something about our planet, we're going to look at mass migrations of populations in the next 20 and 30 years. Countries are going to become uninhabitable. And we're not talking about countries with just a few 100,000 people. We're talking about areas where the current population might be 10, 15 or 30 million people who are going to have to move because there's just no place for them to live. There's no water, it's too hot. You can't sustain humanity in those countries. And so when we talk about mass migrations like that, that becomes societal, it becomes ethnic, it becomes cultural. And these are all things that I don't think our governments are anywhere near prepared for, nor want to be prepared for, but just don't, again, they're not connecting the dots with the changing environment and the ramifications. So
and
that
it's
would
already,
be my...
climate refugees are already happening. We saw it first, perhaps in Syria, where that led to all the unrest. The farmers were coming into the city because they had droughts and couldn't make a living. Central American, Mexican, people trying to come across our border because they can no longer live sustainably where they are. And right now, as we speak, Afghanistan, in part, the unrest there. And it's so scary because they have so much they're dealing with. They have droughts and they're having trouble providing food for their people. And under the Taliban, God knows. So, and this is the problem. It's sort of like compounding, problems. And there's so many that it's kind of easy, but shouldn't be, to kind of put climate change on the back burner again and again is what's breaking. Well, the planet's breaking, the climate's breaking. And I think, that's why we're doing Green TV. If we don't make this front and center news every day, and of course, it's not just one story, the environment, we're talking our food, our transportation, our buildings, our oceans, our economy, our energy system, and everything needs to transition, into something better. And one would hope that the COVID crisis taught us a couple of things, like one, nature's in charge, not us. She can do fine without us, not so much the other way around, and how quickly things can go bad, like overnight, right?
Correct. And I mean, I don't think the movie was Independence Day, but they're talking about the North Atlantic water cycle and the water flows there. And when we're looking at massive outflows of cold water into the North Atlantic from the Arctic, these sorts of things, they happen over time, but once they happen, they're irreversible. And we need to be really cognizant of the total effects that these things are having on us. Everything comes back to the environment. It's not just the weather, it's the plants, it's the animals. I mean, in the bushfires in Australia, we burnt out something like 80% of all beehives in Australia were destroyed. So we have this massive pollination problem for our flora and fauna and our vegetation systems. We were having to move beehives all over Australia to try and help them regrow. People don't understand the value of bees to our society and our environment. Just one aspect. And
seeing the koala bears and the kangaroos burnt, it's just heartbreaking. And, one hopes that wakes people up. How many more disasters, mega disasters, do we have to go through? And it really is the environment, stupid. There's no economy, there's no good health, there's no good anything on a bad planet. Hello, no good jobs on a dead planet.
Correct.
So we need to connect those dots and scale up the solutions, because I mean, there was a trend, probably still is, of young people going into farming in this country, but they've quickly seen if you can't predict the weather, how can you hope to make a living, and if we don't have crops, then none of us are going to live. So it is so all connected. It is so important that it would almost be funny if it wasn't tragic, the way, at least in this country, we've, government, corporate America, the media has downplayed these issues as if it's a fringe movement, like, oh, the environmentalists lost around today. Well, the environmentalists lost, we all lost, at least those of us who eat, breathe, or drink. It's just that subtle and not so subtle bias that really has to change. And the sad thing is just that I always predicted, and I'm certainly not alone in it, saying by the time people realize that, it'll be too late. And we're kind of there. Like, how do we go from problem to, oh yeah, we're screwed, nothing to do. And that's going to kill us more than anything. And we didn't even talk about the jet stream, because that, I think, maybe one of the scariest, developments yet, is just like, once we screw up the jet stream, we go into an ice age or something. And I'll close with this. I was trained by Al Gore in 2007, part of his climate reality training. And, you know, Al Gore was our hero, my hero. My husband thought I was secretly having an affair with him because every time Al Gore was speaking, I'd get on a plane and go see him. And I told my husband after 3 days of hearing Gore going on and on, I said, okay, Gore is now a bore. I don't want to hear him anymore. His voice is just driving me nuts. The one thing I remember from that, with hundreds of slides, was Al Gore on the stage. He took off his belt and he held up his belt, buckle in one hand, tail in the other, and he held it like a bell curve. And he said, the planet is like this, and you can wiggle and you can shake and you can punch and it will be resilient to a point. And if you push too hard and too long and too much, all of a sudden, and you never know when this is going to happen, boom, and the belt slammed on the floor. And it was so jarring. And every time we hear about one of these developments, I still get goosebumps. It was that traumatic because it's happening now. Like, how far are we going to push Mother Earth? How far are we going to push nature? And then it snaps. And this web of life is very intricate. And we don't know how it all got here, but we certainly don't want to be the ones to ruin it. But we kind of need to change course yesterday across all fronts if that's not going to happen. So sorry, that's just my little hint.
I think it's very true. I think in closing, I would say that I believe in the business communities that we are starting to see the influence of insurance, reinsurance in businesses. And I think that we'll find that over the next 5 to 10 years, insurance companies are going to really start to apply the economic pressure to companies to say that we won't insure your business operations any longer because what you're doing is environmentally damaging and unsustainable. And I think that once businesses find that the cost of doing business becomes so high that they will be forced to make changes. It's those cost elements that come into the boardroom more so than anything else, I believe. I mean, I would like to think that everybody is interested in the planet and interested in doing everything ethically and morally correct. But I think the most of the boardrooms of the world are controlled by money. And it's when the people around them say to them, listen, if you don't do this, you're going to wipe out $1 billion worth of asset value of your company, which is going to affect your share price, which might affect your remuneration package. Then and only then will some of these companies start to take notice. We are seeing that start to happen in Australia, and companies are starting to change. Our two largest supermarket chains have both got serious green commitments. And so I can only hope that corporates do see the wicked in their ways and make the changes. But I think insurance, with the size of the calamities around the world that we're seeing, that they are just uninsurable for much longer. And insurance companies will go broken. If we don't have insurance companies, we don't have businesses, we don't have homes. You know, it's the one trigger, if you think about it, if you can't get insurance for your house is not worth anything. If you can't get insurance for your business.
And when you need fire and flood insurance more than ever in places you didn't used to, you know, I don't know how much longer they can absorb it because they just raise our rates and we all pay for it. Same with medical costs. But it is true that when the insurance industry and the military and other sort of, you know, institutions really start taking on climate change and factoring it into their operations and their costs, it's not for tree huggers anymore.
Indeed. I think the actuaries of the world are going to have a far greater influence than they've probably ever had before when it comes to climate. And hopefully they start to make that influence a bit stronger sooner rather than later. Yeah.
And hopefully people understand it's not just heat that global warming causes, extreme heat. It's extreme cold, it's extreme snow, rain. It's everything that you don't want more of, you know. And in the Bay Area, I say I grew up there where our weather was just beautiful, and we're getting more beautiful weather. It's too beautiful because it hardly ever rains. And while you have blue sky and people out on the bay enjoying their kayaks and paddle boarding, there's a cost for that. You know, it's just not raining. And it's nice to talk to you.
We could go on for days, Betsy.
So thank you, Charles Alder, for being an eco-solutionary from Australia. It's great to hear what's going on down there, and hopefully we can learn from each other.
We will indeed, Betsy. Thank you for having me on today. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.